Well, yesterday was pretty interesting. They Trump supporters had their little March on Washington thing, I guess, to show support for Donald Trump. And as expected, going into a den of the left that Washington is, there were a lot of people who came out to oppose them. You have to remember, D.C. went like 95% for Joe Biden. Always goes like 95% for the Democrat. And so if you walk in there, wearing Trump paraphernalia or Trump gear, MAGA hat, Trump shirt, waving a Trump flag or an American flag for that matter, you're going to get a lot of hate. You're going to get people who, who push back on you, who say, you're not welcome here, to paraphrase Maxine Waters. And that's exactly what happened. Very unsurprisingly, I was not at all surprised to see that Trump supporters marching through Washington were, assaulted and accosted, and old people were hit, and stragglers who were not staying with the group, especially after dark, were, they went through some trials. You saw people crying, and they didn't really seem to understand. So I guess the sorts of folks who came out to this thing were not all, hardened Proud Boy types, culture warriors, people who understand that these folks don't like you and that they want to hurt you. These were, for lack of a better term, Boomercons. For the most part, obviously, there were notable, contingents of Proud Boy types there who did know that they were in for a fight. But your average people, even if they weren't technically baby boomers, just seemed like ordinary Republican voters, people who were confused by what was going on. There was an old man who was shoved to the ground, and they, dumped some liquid on him. We don't know what that was. So I won't say that it was pee or something like that. Although Antifa has done that in the past. I don't know if BLM has that, as an organized tactic. And it's hard to say. People keep going back and forth calling it BLM versus Antifa. I mean, there's not really much of a dividing line in this case, I don't think. I think it can all just be broadly termed the left-wing mob. And originally I had no plans on talking about this event because it seemed pretty predictable to me, the outcome of what happened. But to me, the real story here is that so many of these people were not expecting this. That a lot of people seem to be quite energized by what happened yesterday and, in essence, red-pilled. I didn't know that there really were a lot of people who would be motivated enough to support Trump to drive all the way to D.C. from wherever, or fly there from wherever they're from and stay in a hotel and go out to this rally thing, and who didn't know that, the people on the left literally want them dead and don't want them around and don't like them. But I guess for a lot of these people, they just, that didn't really sink in. And, getting smacked upside the head or, having obscenities spat your way, I guess woke a lot of these people up. And especially, what you're seeing on Twitter and things. You're seeing much more of an acceleration, or escalation, I'll say. I won't use the term acceleration. An escalation in rhetoric and an urgency on the parts, on the part of, normal conservative pundits and things. People warning now about, sort of maybe tongue-in-cheek saying, hey, you keep up with stuff like this is how you end up with a fascist dictator. Is, a left-wing mob gets out of control. And then, people get to the point to where they say, well, we'll take anyone who will put an end to the left-wing mob. And that's how you end up with your dictator. Now, obviously, I don't think that they mean that person is Trump at the moment, but they mean sometime in the future. And that is true. But the fact that people are now starting to recognize that on the mainstream right, to me, is evidence that, they're starting to wake up to the reality of the situation. Not that I endorse that at all. I mean, I don't think that'd be a good idea to have a dictator to seize power in America and, reimpose order. I don't think that would make things better. I think that would only make things worse. I think that we have to go in the other direction, as I've talked about, time and time again. And, we still might as a result of what happened yesterday. People on the right realizing that you can't deal with the left, and that rather, well, I shouldn't put it that way so much, because the left would say the same thing about the right. What I mean is that left and right in America cannot deal with one another, that we cannot simply, hash out our differences and shake hands at the end of the day and say, oh, gee, we're all Americans, Wally, because that's just not true. We're not all the same. We're not one people. This is a fallacy. It's been a fallacy for a long time, and I would argue it always has been. It's not that noticeable because we didn't used to have this very centralized government that was controlled mostly by one person who's elected every 4 years. And as that's become more and more true, these presidential elections become higher and higher stakes, and the real differences between Americans become more obvious. And so people realize that they can't just sit down and allow their political enemies to win, because for other people in this country to be happy, that means that a lot of other people have to suffer. I think that everybody should realize that. We'll all be much happier at that point once we realize that politics cannot solve our differences. Once we recognize that this is not the solution, then we can start actually working towards a real solution, a resolution to our differences, which, in my opinion, and the opinion increasingly of people across this country, is that there needs to be a national divorce in the United States, and not just a divorce, between the two major political factions, but hopefully, a full dissolution of the United States. Because people on the right, I think, yesterday realized that violence, like we saw yesterday, which was totally tolerated by the media, was not seen as anything beyond the pale. In fact, there were people defending Antifa all day and comparing them to World War II veterans, which is hilarious for many reasons that other people have pointed out. I don't need to dwell on that. But, people can't tolerate that being the norm in their country. People realize that that is now normal, and that is going to continue for the foreseeable future. They will seek to remedy that. They will start exploring alternative solutions. And I don't mean, retaliatory violence. I don't think that's a good idea. My goal is for there to be less violence in the world overall. Particularly, I would like there to be less violence where I live. And that won't happen until the conversation shifts away from, oh, gee, how are we going to win this presidential election? Or, who should we support for president? As long as that's the conversation, there's not going to be much progress made. Because I know that no matter who wins the presidency, things are going to continue to get worse in the United States from a socio-political standpoint. Society will continue to break down, and our politics will become more and more dysfunctional. And so the conversation needs to become, how do we de-escalate our politics? What alternative sorts of orders could we look at? What solutions to alleviate the stress on our system could be explored? One of those solutions I talked about yesterday was nullification. A lot of people are worried about what a President Biden might do. National lockdowns, bans on online gun sales, all sorts of other executive actions. Well, a pretty easy remedy for that is nullification, to where state and local authorities say, we're not going to enforce those federal edicts. We are not going to recognize them. Another easy solution that conservatives, and I think the left, because the left is already engaged in nullification, as I talked about before, with drug laws and immigration laws. They've nullified those all over the country. But the right needs to do that too. And what nullification would lead to is a de facto form of decentralization of power. I don't think that we're going to be able to get people to agree in Washington to give up power and to punt things back to the states. You're not going to get people on the left and the right to say, hey, let's not decide this in Washington, because it's going to be whoever has the majority at the time is going to try and impose their will on all 50 states. That's just the state of civility in Washington right now. And so I think the only way we achieve decentralization that way is through, nullification. Now, the next thing is that once we've essentially nullified powers of the federal government, are people going to want to continue paying to that, money to that federal government, taxes? Are they going to want to continually be bound, by the yoke of the federal government? Are these states going to want to be, strung together? My guess is no. And the logical conclusion, once you've, or the logical next step once you've reached that conclusion, is that states should secede. And I don't mean secede and form, a new confederacy or something like that. Very low IQ people think secession and then go, oh, you mean like the Confederates? No, we're not talking about forming a new federal government and just stripping away, or just, putting one thing into the Constitution to say, okay, we're going to have the United States government, but slavery is, a universal right or something like that. I'm talking about something much more radical than what the Confederates did, and that is just states saying, hey, we're going to go our own way. We don't need the central government in Washington. We don't need federal money. We don't need to pay federal taxes. We're just going to do everything ourselves because we can do that better. And in the process of that, you might even see state borders change, just like actually you did in the 1860s. Virginia split into West Virginia and Virginia. West Virginia stayed in the Union, and the rest of Virginia joined the Confederacy. We could see, as the United States writ large begins to break down, individual states might break down, and your more left-wing parts of the states, let's say your major cities, might decide to govern themselves differently than the countryside, than the more rural or suburban areas. And that, again, would be a good thing. That would be okay. That would be just fine. It would make much more sense than what we have now, to where people in town and country have to live by the same sets of laws when they have very different political interests and very different ways of life. But again, these are things that currently are not even under discussion. People are rather talking about, okay, well, how best can we impose our will, rather than looking at, the reality is that we're never going to be able to come to an agreement. Nobody's ever going to be able to get what they want. So how do we go about getting what we want? How do we reform our political system to make it more amenable, to make it to where people can actually, achieve their goals? And so events like yesterday, I think, do a lot to push people in the right direction, at least on the right, because lots of people on the left, particularly the people who are committing the acts of violence, the Antifa types, realize that they're not going to work, and they don't want to live in the same country with these right-winger types. And so once everybody gets on the same page and they realize what's going on, that there is no America, that there is no nation left at this point, then things can start to change for the better. And so I'm not saddened by what I saw yesterday. What I saw yesterday was what I expected. It's not a nice thing. It's not a happy thing. It's just reality. But I'm heartened by the response, by the realizations that people are starting to have. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.